Okay, hi there. Welcome to a special revision video. We're going to be taking a few minutes to think about and look at the issue of deglobalisation. After decades of increasing globalisation, there now seems to be a slowing of globalisation, even perhaps a turn to deglobalisation, meaning a deceleration of trade and investment and movement of people around the world. And will the COVID pandemic accelerate a process away from hyper-globalisation, or will most aspects of our interconnected world demonstrate more resilience in the face of severe economic shocks? Well, first, a quick reminder of some of the fundamental building blocks of globalisation. I'm sure you've studied this part of your A-level and IB economics. It's a really key macro topic for exams and other assessments. Globalisation comprises many different elements. It's essentially the movement across national borders of goods and services, people, and often, perhaps most importantly, ideas and technologies. And essentially the pillars involve trade and capital flows, including foreign direct investment, international labour migration, and crucially commitment to global rules, global standards, for example industry standards in different sectors, and also the continued stature of key global institutions such as the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, and also the World Health Organization. So what do we mean by deglobalisation? Well, essentially it's a partial reversal of the process of globalisation described earlier. It's basically where the interdependence and integration between businesses and countries across borders becomes a little weaker. And for example, the growth of trade in goods and services and the stock and flow of investment between countries might decline. Now, what evidence is there that the world economy is experiencing deglobalisation? Well, this chart shows global trade. This is the value of imports and exports added together, expressed as a percentage of the value of world GDP. It's published each year by the IMF. And you can see that since 1970, essentially the share of global trade in world output more than doubled through to about 2006, 2007. But of course, since then, there has been a slowdown in the ratio of global trade in goods and services expressed as a share of GDP. That said, it's still, despite the turbulence, despite the shocks of Brexit and the pandemic and the global financial crisis and Donald Trump and much else besides, the ratio of trade to GDP is still remarkably close to its all-time high. That said, this chart is also quite revealing. Whilst in the first half of the first decade of the new century, from 2000 to 2006, global trade value was rising well above GDP. These are year-on-year percentages. In a number of years since, particularly of course since 2009 and again 2015, the real value of global trade has declined and lagged the growth of world GDP. And here's another little snippet of evidence for deglobalisation. We see here a decline in the annual flow of world foreign direct investment, or FDI, measured again as a percentage of GDP. The high watermark was 2000 and again in 2007. In January 2019, in fact, The Economist published an article using the phrase slowbalisation, suggesting a slowing of the increase in global connectedness. I'm using this chart. This is from DHL, which is basically trying to track the growth of trade and capital flows, information and people. And you can see there has been a flattening in terms of globalization, particularly, of course, since 2008, 2009. And 2020 undoubtedly marked a contraction in the size of world trade and investment. So what might help to explain the current challenges to our globalised world? What factors might be contributing towards deglobalisation to the extent that it's happening? Again, I can't explain every factor, but I just wanted to pick out maybe half a dozen for you. Here are some of the drivers that might be causing deglobalisation. I think fundamentally, of course, we've seen the rise of populist politics in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, obviously in the United States with the election of Trump in November 2016. And post-global financial crisis, of course, we have seen a return to protectionism, including many countries bringing in perhaps less tariff barriers, but more non-tariff barriers. And in part, this is a response to the financial crisis, but also a reaction to growing trade imbalances. Trade tensions between many countries have clearly increased, particularly between the United States and China. Something like 1,800 different trade protectionist measures were logged in 2019-2020 by the World Trade Organization. So the rise of populism and the slight return to protectionism is clearly important. Linked with that is a shift towards bilateral and regional trade deals. This is sometimes called regionalisation, as distinct from globalisation. So there's been a decline in the influence of the World Trade Organization. Of course, is there really to police the trading system and to try to get countries to agree to multilateral trade deals. There's been a shift towards bilateral deals between two countries and trade deals between regional blocs. There's also been a return in some countries, China would be a good example, of capital controls, where governments limit the free flow of capital across national borders, and a movement more towards managed floating exchange rates away from free floating exchange rates. So many countries now trying to manipulate the flow of capital, influence portfolio and hot money flows in an attempt to move the currency in a particular direction. And in some cases, for example, with Brazil versus the States, this has amplified and intensified trade tensions between the countries. Economic nationalism linked to populism has grown in many examples there. Disputes most recently over vaccine exports, including the spat between the EU and the UK. Governments exerting more control over mergers and takeovers on grounds of national interest, and growing technology rivalries. I think a really good example there would be the United States trying to reduce China's access to Western markets and technologies. Of course, the United States under Trump banned Huawei from supplying equipment for its 5G network, and sought to persuade the USA's allies to follow suit. So a rise of nationalism. And we're also starting to see many businesses in a sense shifting away from the high watermark of really extended global supply chains, where you might be manufacturing a washing machine or something in 15 or 16 different countries, sourcing your inputs, your components from right across the world economy. There has been a tightening of global supply chains. Some reshoring has taken place. Manufacturing has returned. Some textile manufacturing has returned to the UK, for example, from China. So a lot of businesses now recognising that having very extended supply chains involves risks as well as opportunities. We know, of course, there's been a movement away from free movement of labour across borders. Many countries now bringing in point systems or even tighter controls of migration. The UK's departure from the European Union marked a landmark movement there. And the final point, I suppose, is the immediate impact of the pandemic. The pandemic with lockdown has exposed the resilience of supply chains. Tens of millions of migrant workers have been forced to return to their countries of origin due to the pandemic. And of course, global trade has contracted as the world economy has gone into recession. So what is the underlying cause of deglobalisation if it's happening? The rise of populism and a return to different forms of economic nationalism and protectionism. COVID-19, of course, is a pinch point, a punctuation point in this wider story. And you can make a case for saying that the pandemic has been a very important factor contributing potentially to deglobalisation. The most obvious impact is the movement of people, the collapse of international travel, which apparently is on track to fall all the way back to levels last seen in 1990, over 30 years ago. But here's an interesting statistic which I found from a report. that if we look at Wuhan, which of course was the epicenter of the original outbreak, 300 of the world's top 500 companies have some facilities in that province where Wuhan is the capital. And I guess this exposed the vulnerability of hyper-globalisation, geographical specialisation in outsourcing components and manufacturing. It really did make a clear point about that. Professor Ian Golding is well worth reading on this, and I do recommend you Google Ian Golding and deglobalisation to get some good articles. He argued that the previous model of globalisation was not sustainable and escalated systemic risks, including financial crises, climate change, growing inequality and pandemics. Ian Golding, tremendous economist, is the author of a book called The Butterfly Defect. And his main argument is that globalization spreads opportunities but also risks. So it's brilliant for your evaluation. So he talks about hyperconnectivity, increasingly complex systems in the world economy, from manufacturing to healthcare to digital services and education. So your major global financial centers, they generate big opportunities, but they might also be the source of financial contagion. Global cyber systems allow our world digital economy to operate, but can also be the source of viruses. Our global network of airport hubs means it's easier to travel and get goods and services to market, but bring the danger of illicit flows and the spread of pandemics. And in a sense, deglobalisation is in part a response to this lack of sustainability. Well, is deglobalisation inevitable? My argument would be that the answer is no. And again, using the DHL Global Connectedness Index for 2020 as my base point, I think a sense of long-run context is quite important. You see, for every newspaper headline about another trade dispute between countries or a cross-border merger that's been blocked, every single day, tens of millions of businesses sell products overseas and manufacture across national borders. I think this is, as the DHL do say, the world remains close to a record high of globalisation. If you've got the long run of exports as a share of GDP, still around 30%. FDI is around 35% of world GDP, and the migrant population, again, likely to fall in 2020, but is about 3% of the world population, or about 270 million people. So when we talk about deglobalisation, I think you have to put that in terms of a long-run context. And my final slide is really to say that in many ways you can make a case for saying that globalisation may well turn out to be more resilient to these shocks than perhaps people would expect. Let me just make 6 points. First of all, I think our desire for overseas travel and study is strong, across all ages, by the way, and it's likely, once we truly resolve the issues in the pandemic, it's likely to rebound, I think, pretty sharply. Escape the noise of the next few months and perhaps the next year or two, but it will pick up again. Interestingly, if you just look at things like parcel and data flows, massive expansion in global data. So it's not just about manufacturing widgets, it's about the global trade in data and information and ideas, and that's obviously going to continue rising post-pandemic. Yes, point 3, yes, the world economy has shrunk this year, global trade has dipped, but actually not as severe as many feared, and much less than in the wake of the global financial crisis. And yes, labour migration has fallen, but of course technology is erasing virtual borders. The physical movement of labour is not as important as it once was. You can employ people remotely to do tasks, often skilled tasks, in any country. They don't necessarily, of course, have to move country to do it. There's also some signs emerging of global collaboration. Signs, for example, that countries might be thinking about having minimum corporation tax rates. There's been a huge global collaboration in scientific research. Number of co-authorship of articles and scholarly journals has gone up. Countries cooperating with each other to fast track vaccine research and testing and deployment. some really good and positive aspects of world global collaboration at a scientific and intellectual level. And also, trade liberalisation is not dead. So although there have been many examples of non-tariff barriers introduced and clearly persistent trade tensions between the USA and China, elsewhere in the world there's been a whole cluster of new trade agreements, often signed between major regional trading blocs. Go back to November 2020, 15 Asian Pacific countries signed the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Now, that deal links 10 member countries of ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, along with China, Japan, South Korea, Australia and New Zealand. Something like 30% of the world economy signed this important agreement in November 2020. The European Union has been concluding partnerships, one with Japan in 2018. The UK, of course, post-Brexit is trying to sign as many free trade deals as it can. So the reality, I guess, is that people, companies and countries continue to connect and click and collaborate and do business with each other. I think it's a little dangerous to assume that deglobalisation is inevitable. And of course, this is not the first time that the world has deglobalised. Between World War I and either World War II, you'll know if you've studied your depression economics, world trade collapsed and there was a steep fall in the export to GDP ratio, far greater than anything we've seen in the last 10-15 years. Martin Wolf, the FT's senior economics correspondent, has said the plausible future is not, repeat, not that international exchange is going to die, but it's likely to become more regional and more virtual. Globalization is a process that will go through many iterations. What we thought was globalization 10-15 years ago may turn out to be a different animal, a different beast in the years to come. Well, thank you for watching this presentation, this revision video on deglobalisation. I think it's an important concept, particularly for those of you taking macro assignments and exams in the near future. Huge thanks for connecting with me on this one. Stay safe and see you again sometime soon.